You see a woman in silk robes walking toward the edge. She's 20 years old. Her husband died 3 days ago. The family watches. They're not stopping her. They're counting on her. Because if she jumps, if she starves, if she takes that silver blade they gave her on her wedding day and opens her own throat, the government builds a stone gate with her name on it. Tax breaks, civil service appointments for the sons, honor that lasts centuries. But if she refuses, if she remarries, if she tries to leave, her children lose everything. They can't take the exams. They can't hold office. Some families don't wait. They stage it, make it look like devotion when it's murder for profit. This is Joseon Korea. 1400 years after Confucius wrote his texts, and the scholars here twisted his words into a suicide machine that ran for 500 years. Women feared it. Families weaponized it. The state rewarded it. What turned widow into a death sentence? In Chinese characters that translate as fierce or intense woman, the intensity is chastity, chastity beyond death. The Joseon dynasty ran from 1392 to 1910. By the time it collapsed, thousands of stone memorial gates dotted the countryside, marking where widows had died rather than remarry. Some starved at their husbands' graves for years. Some used the unjangdo, the silver dagger, within hours of hearing the news. Some were 15 and engaged when the boy died before the ceremony even happened. They killed themselves anyway because the betrothal contract counted as marriage. The custom exploded after 2 invasions shattered the country's confidence, and the Neo-Confucian scholars tightened their grip to restore order. But the roots go back further, back to when the law changed and remarriage became treason against your dead husband's ghost. If you value documented Korean history and social systems like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from academic publications, including Jungwon Kim's research on widow chastity published in Gender and History Journal in 2014, court documents housed at the National Museum of Korea, the Gyeongguk Daejeon legal code preserved at the National Library of Korea and designated as a national treasure in 2025, and UNESCO World Heritage documentation of Joseon memorial structures. These aren't pop history sites. These are primary legal codes and peer-reviewed academic studies tracking the actual mechanics of how this system worked. Now back to the information. 319 laws organized by ministry, rights, taxation, personnel, justice, military, public works. Buried in the rights section is the line that would kill thousands of women over the next 4 centuries. Widows who remarry are prohibited. Their sons and grandsons cannot take the civil service examination. They cannot hold government posts. Some versions of the law allowed execution. The prohibition wasn't new. Seongjong's father had started pushing it in 1477, but codifying it in 1485 made it permanent. The penalty hit the children. That's the lever. A Yangban family, the noble class, lived on government salaries. No exam access meant no income, no status, generational poverty. So when a husband died young, the widow faced a calculation. Remarry and destroy your children's future, or stay, serve the in-laws, raise the sons, die alone decades later, or take the third option, die now, die dramatically, die in a way that gets the family a memorial gate and government benefits. A loyal subject does not serve 2 kings. A virtuous woman does not serve 2 husbands. It comes from China's Warring States period, 4th century before the Common Era. Chinese scholars traced it through different texts. By the Song Dynasty, 1060 to 1279, Chinese Neo-Confucians had turned it into doctrine. Zhu Xi, the philosopher Joseon's scholars worshipped, wrote that a woman's chastity mattered more than starvation, better to die than compromise purity. Joseon's founders, overthrowing the Goryeo dynasty in 1392, blamed Goryeo fall on moral laxness. Women in Goryeo had owned property. They inherited equally with brothers. They could divorce. They often lived with their own families after marriage in a system called Namguyogahon, where the husband joined the wife's household. Joseon flipped it. The new system, Chinyoung, forced women into the husband's family, cut them off from birth families. Early Joseon still had remnants of the old ways. King Sejong in the 1400s acknowledged remarriage rights. But each generation tightened. Each generation made Confucian gender hierarchy more rigid. By 1485, it was law. Guabu means a woman whose husband is lost, but the other term, mimanjin, translates literally as one who has not died yet, as in she should have died but hasn't. The language made survival shameful. The elite women carried unjangdo from childhood, silver daggers. Some had steel blades engraved with characters for fidelity or devotion. Some had hidden chopsticks to test food for poison. But the primary purpose sat in every wedding gift, every coming-of-age ceremony. The blade was there to protect chastity. First, by fighting off assault. Second, by suicide, if the fight failed. The philosophy was yulnya. A woman follows one man. Before marriage, her father. During marriage, her husband. In widowhood, her son. But between husband's death and son's maturity, who did she follow? Neo-Confucian scholars said the dead husband. His authority continued from the grave. Remarriage was adultery. Adultery deserved death. Some memorialize women who killed tigers attacking their husbands. Some who nursed husbands through fatal illness, then starved themselves. Some who were engaged briefly, widowed immediately, and chose death over remarriage. The monuments emphasize that women must be strong to defend what is right and defend their chastity. The young widow, barely married, becomes a symbolic figure. Her choice to die rather than live demonstrates perfect loyalty. These are the stories the government promoted. The local magistrates reported them. The king awarded the family. The stonemasons carved the gates. Within days, they take the southern fortresses. Within weeks, they're marching on the capital. King Seonjo abandons the palace 15 days after the war starts. The citizens, enraged, burn Gyeongbokgung Palace. The Japanese advance with matchlock firearms. Joseon soldiers have bows and a few cannons. No guns, no preparation. The Japanese occupy most of the peninsula. The war becomes a grinding stalemate. Admiral Yi Sun-sin destroys Japanese supply fleets in naval battles. The Ming Dynasty sends reinforcements. The Japanese can't hold the north. They can't break the Korean Navy. Hideyoshi dies in 1598. The Japanese withdraw, but Korea is devastated. Entire regions burned, farmland destroyed, population collapsed. Arable land drops from 1.5 million gyol before the invasion to 300,000 gyol after. 80% of productive land gone. Famine follows, disease follows. The administrative system that tracked landholding and taxation breaks down. The social order fractures. The culture's response was to demand those women kill themselves rather than live with dishonor. The belief spread that the Yunjangda tradition intensified after the invasion. Women started carrying the daggers not just symbolically, but as actual suicide weapons. The idea was to deny the enemy the conquest of Korean women's bodies. Die before rape. The historical record shows it worked both ways. Some women used the blades to fight, some used them on themselves, some did neither and survived. But the scholarship afterward, the Neo-Confucian intellectuals writing the histories, praised only the dead ones. Only the suicides got memorial gates. The survivors got silence or shame. The later Jin, the Manchu Confederation that would become the Qing dynasty, sends 30,000 troops under Prince Amen. They cross the northern border in January. The Joseon garrison towns fall quickly. Mao Wenlong, the Ming general stationed in Uiju, flees to the Bohai Sea. The Nungan fortress falls January 21st. The Anju garrison blows up their own gunpowder rather than surrender. Pyongyang falls without a fight. King Injo evacuates to Ganghwa Island. The war ends in 3 months with a treaty. Joseon becomes a tributary of later Jin. But the treaty doesn't hold. Joseon keeps backing Ming. Later, Jin becomes Qing in 1636 and demands Joseon submit fully. Joseon refuses. December 1636, Hong Taiji leads a 3-pronged attack with Manchu, Mongol, and Han Chinese forces. They bypass the fortresses. They head straight for the capital. King Injo retreats to Namen Mountain Fortress on December 14th. He's trapped. Ganghwa Island falls in a day. The Qing capture his second son and his consorts. Injo's relief forces lose every battle. 45 days into the siege, with no food and no help coming, Injo surrenders. The terms are brutal. Joseon abandons Ming, adopts the Qing calendar, sends hostages including the crown prince, sends troops and supplies to help Qing destroy Ming. The psychological impact cuts deeper than the military defeat. Joseon saw itself as the civilized kingdom loyal to the true emperor in China. Losing to barbarian Manchus and being forced to betray Ming shattered that identity. Court scholars said the nation needed moral purification, stricter adherence to Confucian principles, tighter control of women's behavior. After, it becomes widespread. Lower classes start imitating Yangban customs to prove loyalty. The government actively promotes widow suicide as patriotic. As proof, the nation hasn't lost its moral center. The rewards expand. Families that produce a yolnyo get tax exemptions. Civil service positions for male relatives. The stone memorial gates, yolnyomen, become status symbols. Some are simple markers. Some are elaborate structures with pillars and inscribed tablets. They stand at village entrances. They appear in genealogy books. They announce to everyone passing that this family produced a woman virtuous enough to choose death. Widows cutting off their fingers to disfigure themselves, so families can't remarry them, but also can't claim they maintained beauty for their dead husbands. Some families don't ask. Trial documents from late Joseon, analyzed and research published in the Korean journal Uisahak in 2008, show gender-based interpretation of suicide. Men's suicides were called foolish acts by the elite because normal men wouldn't kill themselves. But women's suicides for chastity were praised and rewarded. The same act, different judgment based on gender, and another factor, class. Yangban widows got prizes for suicide. Yangban men rarely killed themselves. Common people died by suicide more frequently than nobles. The contradiction reveals suicide wasn't personal choice. It was social pressure enforced unevenly. And when social pressure failed, some families escalated to murder. The family reports she killed herself from grief. The magistrate investigates, sometimes finds signs of coercion, sometimes finds outright murder. The punishment was severe when discovered. The crime went beyond murder. It was molmang, deception that fooled the king and the court. If authorities proved a family staged a suicide to fraudulently claim Yeolnyo status, they executed the main perpetrators. They canceled the local memorial gates. They demoted the entire region's administrative rank, which meant worse tax treatment and dismissal of the magistrate for failing to prevent the crime. The punishment matched the severity because the system depended on genuine cases. If widows were being murdered for benefits, it corrupted the entire moral framework. But detection was hard. A woman dies alone at her husband's tomb. She's been starving herself for months. Is that suicide or murder by neglect? A woman dies in her room with the Yunjongdo in her hand. Did she choose it, or did someone force her? They flee far away and start over. Some villages had customs where destitute widows would go to shrines with their dress ribbon torn, signaling they were willing to be taken by any man who wanted to travel. This happened because the alternative was starving in the husband's household with no income, no property rights, and constant surveillance. The tradition appears in court records and in later literature. It was illegal, but widespread enough that everyone knew the term. The state couldn't enforce the remarriage prohibition completely, especially in lower classes where economic survival trumped ideology. But Yangban widows had no escape. Their status locked them in. Their wealth made them targets. Their family's reputation rode on their behavior. The Chiljojiak, 7 deadly sins that let a husband divorce a wife, shows the imbalance. Disobedience to in-laws, failure to produce a son, adultery, jealousy, grave illness, talkativeness, theft. Men could divorce for any of these reasons. Women had no equivalent list. Women couldn't initiate divorce. The state or the husband could. The adultery clause included widows who remarried. King Seongjong's cousin was executed for cohabiting with a male servant after being widowed. The court interpreted sharing a bed as sexual activity. She was royal lineage. The penalty was death. For Yangban women who violated the remarriage ban, the children lost noble status, cast out. The threat was real. Lower-class widows who remarried got beaten with a stick called gangjo if caught. Yangban widows faced execution or exile. The hierarchy applied pressure differently, but pressure existed at every level. She remained at his tomb for 3 years, following the mourning customs. She starved herself to death. When Yeongjo heard about it, he sent a Yeolnyoman to honor her. The king's personal sorrow is mentioned in the record. The language frames it as tragic but admirable. No one asks if Mrs. Lee wanted to live. No one records if the one family encouraged her starvation. The system assumed her choice was correct. Suffering was proof of sincerity. Death was proof of loyalty. The historical person married young. The husband died before the wedding ceremony was completed. To secure the Yeolnyo award, the mother-in-law tried to murder Yihua and stage it as suicide. The plot was to show the young woman's loyalty to a spouse she barely knew. The story circulated because the murder plot was discovered. But how many weren't? How many families successfully killed inconvenient widows and collected the benefits? The incentive structure rewarded the widow's death more than her survival. A living widow was a financial burden with no earning power, no ability to remarry into another family, and no inheritance rights if she had no son. A dead widow who died dramatically was a financial asset, generating government benefits for decades. If you value the deep research on Korean social history like this, subscribe. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched using trial documents analyzed in peer-reviewed academic journals, memorial inscriptions cataloged by UNESCO, and legal code analysis from scholars at institutions like Harvard University and the University of Seoul. These aren't speculation. These are documented patterns in court records and administrative histories spanning 5 centuries. Now back to the information. When his son died shortly after marriage, Yi Huang allowed his daughter-in-law to remarry and return to her family. For the 16th century, this was radical. It violated everything Neo-Confucian orthodoxy demanded. Yi Huang also married a woman whose entire family had been executed for treason. Taking in someone from a disgraced household was another extraordinary breach of custom. These acts are recorded specifically because they were so unusual. One scholar in one generation making humane choices against the system. The fact that historians preserve these stories as remarkable shows how rigid the norm was. Most families enforced the rules. Most widows had no yi huang to advocate for them. Women's space. Yangban homes separated male and female areas. The sarangche, outer rooms for men. The anbang, inner rooms for women. During the day, Yangban women could not leave the house. If they had to go somewhere, they traveled in a covered palanquin called gama. No one could see their face or body. The Newebop, doctrine of inner and outer separation, made public space male territory. Women who walked openly in daylight could be punished. Some late Joseon customs had commoner women who bore sons bearing their breasts in public as pride symbols. But Yangban widows stayed hidden. They ate once a day if maintaining mourning rituals. They wore plain clothes. They served the in-laws. They raised children if they had any. If they had no son, their position in the household was precarious. They were dodungnyo, thieves, because raising them cost money with no return. Married daughters were chulga wane, outsiders who left the family. The sayings reflect the calculation. Women cost resources. Only sons generate value. A widow with no son generated nothing and consumed rice that could feed someone useful. Families started calling daughters thieves because of the cost. The Neo-Confucian logic said women had to obey in-laws after marriage, so the birth family didn't need to provide inheritance beyond the dowry. Households headed by women disappeared at Joseon's beginning. The state didn't recognize a widow as head of household unless she had a son and was managing things until he matured. Then she was managing her son's household. Not her own. She owned nothing. She inherited nothing. If her husband died with no children, she had no legal claim on his property. The brothers-in-law inherited. She stayed as a dependent, or she died. The state usually ruled in their favor. The logic was that widows, as representatives of the direct line, could ensure proper succession against collateral branches. This was different from China, where widows had less authority over adoption. Korea's lineage principle gave the widow a tool. But fighting in court required resources and support. Many widows had neither. And even winning adoption rights didn't solve the fundamental problem. She was still trapped, still forbidden from remarrying, still expected to die loyal. Estimates suggest the Korean population dropped by 1 million or more during the Imjin War. Famine and disease killed more than combat. Tens of thousands of Koreans were taken to Japan as captives, including skilled artisans and potters. The loss of these craftsmen damaged Korea's economy for decades. The Japanese also looted priceless cultural treasures never returned. The demographic collapse had strange effects. With so many deaths, slave documents defining social status were lost. Some slaves gained freedom because no one could prove their bondage. Some impoverished Yangban became slaves to wealthier families in exchange for guaranteed food. The social structure destabilized. The government's response was to double down on Confucian orthodoxy, stricter gender roles, more emphasis on loyalty and chastity, more rewards for widow suicide. The logic was that if the nation couldn't control external threats, it would control internal behavior. Women's sexuality became a proxy battlefield for national identity. UNESCO catalogs them as part of Joseon dynasty cultural heritage. They're stone structures with pillars, often with detailed carvings. Inscriptions name the woman, her husband's family, the date of death, and the king who granted the honor. Some include narrative descriptions of how she died. Starved for 3 years at the tomb, drowned herself in the river, took poison. The gates function as advertisements. This family produced a virtuous woman. This family values honor over life. The gates weren't uniform. Wealthy families built elaborate ones. Poor families got simple markers. But even a small memorial meant government recognition and benefits. The competition to get one created pressure on widows. If a neighboring family had a Yolnyo moon and yours didn't, it suggested your family lacked virtue, so families pushed daughters-in-law toward death to keep up appearances. The system lasted until the dynasty ended. 1910, Japan annexes Korea. The colonial government dismantles Joseon's administrative structures. The civil service exam system that had punished children of remarried widows disappears. The legal prohibitions on widow remarriage officially end. But cultural attitudes persist. Korean women faced new pressures under Japanese occupation, including forced prostitution in comfort stations. After liberation in 1945, the new Korean governments, North and South, rejected Confucian gender hierarchy officially. But social conservatism remained. It wasn't until the late 20th century that widow remarriage became fully acceptable. Even now, the term Yolnyo carries weight. It means a faithful woman, but it also references that long history of coerced suicide disguised as virtue. The academic analysis in recent decades has reframed the narrative. Jungwon Kim's research on widow chastity and honor in 19th century Korea, published in 2014, examines how chaste suicide functioned as emotional politics. Widows who killed themselves generated honor that male relatives could weaponize in status competitions. The widow's death became a resource. It proved the family's commitment to Confucian values. It signaled they deserved respect and benefits, but the widow herself was erased. Her name appears on a gate, but her choices, her desires, her resistance disappear from the record. The system treated women as instruments of family honor. Their suffering was the point. The more dramatic the suffering, the greater the honor. A widow who died peacefully of old age generated less status than one who starved or bled or drowned herself young. Widows who mutilated themselves, cutting fingers or scarring faces, to make themselves unmarketable, but also to prevent the family from forcing a decision. Self-harm is a third option between suicide and compliance. The trial documents note these cases when families sued to recover the widow or to claim she violated propriety. The courts sometimes sided with the widow if she could prove coercion, but proving coercion meant testifying against your husband's family. In a system where a woman had to obey her in-laws, where disobedience was a divorceable offense, speaking up meant risking everything. Most stayed silent, most endured, some died. Steel blades with characters stamped into the metal, small enough to hide in a sleeve or a waistband, sharp enough to kill. Modern Korean films sometimes feature the daggers as props. The 2003 film Silver Knife uses the Onjangdo as a central symbol, with characters debating the tradition of women using it for suicide after dishonor. The film's climax has a male character decrying the entire custom as oppressive. But in Joseon, that critique didn't exist. Or if it did, it didn't survive in writing. The official histories, written by Yangban scholars, praise the Yolnyo system. It proved Korea's superior morality. It showed women understood their duty. It demonstrated that even in defeat and occupation, the cultural core remained intact. The Mongol invasions in the 13th century had created an earlier version of this pressure. When the Mongols conquered Goryeo, they demanded virgins as tribute, between ages 12 and 16. The Goryeo court set up a marriage bureaucracy to recruit girls and send them to the Mongol court. Records show messengers carrying virgins made the trip more than 50 times over 80 years. Virgins were required because Neo-Confucian ideology valued premarital purity and bloodline purity. Girls committed suicide to avoid being sent. Families married daughters, young to disqualify them from tribute. The trauma embedded deeply. When Ming replaced the Mongols, the Ming court also demanded tribute, calling it strategic marriage. The pattern of foreign powers demanding Korean women for sexual purposes, and Korean society responding with stricter chastity requirements repeats. The Japanese invasion in 1592 triggered another cycle. The belief was that if Korean women couldn't be protected from assault, they should protect themselves by dying. The government published instructional books in Hangul, so even women who couldn't read Chinese could learn the rules. These books, distributed during King Sejong's reign and after, explained what comportment women should exhibit: filial to parents and in-laws, loyal to husbands, chaste in body and thought. The irony is that teaching women to read Hangul, which was easy to learn compared to Chinese characters, eventually freed some women from ignorance. By the late Joseon period, educated women were reading beyond instruction manuals. They were reading literature. Some were writing poetry. Haeon Anseolyeon in the 16th century wrote poems in Korean and Chinese expressing sorrow and isolation. Her work survived because her brothers supported her education. Most women didn't have that support. Most remained illiterate. The instruction books didn't teach reading for enlightenment. They taught reading to internalize subordination. The bond between father and child requiring children to be filial. The bond between husband and wife requiring wives to be faithful. The third bond was unidirectional. Husbands didn't have to be faithful. They could have concubines. The children of concubines were illegitimate but acknowledged. The father's legitimacy wasn't questioned. But if a wife remarried after being widowed, her sons from the second marriage couldn't hold office. The children paid for the mother's choice. That penalty locked widows in. If you loved your children, you stayed. If you wanted your children to have futures, you didn't remarry. And if you really loved them, some families argued, you died dramatically so the family got a memorial gate and benefits that would help your children succeed. The saying they used was that a woman starving means little, but a woman losing chastity means everything. This was policy. Starvation was acceptable. Sexual autonomy was not. The implication was that women should die rather than compromise purity. And many did. The historical record documents them. Mrs. Lee at the one family tomb. Women drowning themselves when Japanese soldiers approached during the invasions. Women taking poison when their husbands died. Women who were 15 and never actually married. They died for an ideal that served everyone except them. The The king got to demonstrate moral governance. The family got status and benefits. The husband's ghost got continued loyalty. The widow got a stone gate with her name on it and oblivion. Yangban men praised widow suicide. They rewarded it. They built the gates. But Yangban men rarely killed themselves. Men's suicide, the documents say, was foolish because normal men wouldn't do it. Only women's suicide for chastity was praised, and it was commoners who died most frequently. Yangban widows had some protection from family wealth and status that let them survive without remarrying. They could live as dependents. Commoner widows had no safety net. Remarriage was economic survival, but the law and social pressure punished them for it. The result was that the poorest women died the most while the richest families collected the most rewards. The memorial gates in wealthy Yangban villages advertised status. The unmarked graves of poor women who starved silently held the actual bodies. The palace women, royal concubines, and court ladies faced their own version of the trap. Royal noble consort Sukbin Choe started as a water-carrying palace slave and became King Sukjong's favorite concubine. She bore him a son who became King Yongjo. Her success was rare. Most giseng, the female entertainers who served Yangban men, were lowest caste, hereditary. Female children of giseng became giseng. Some families sold daughters into giseng schools for money. Some women were condemned to giseng status as punishment for family members' crimes like treason. The giseng were trained in arts, music, conversation. They were expected to be witty, educated, sexually available. They represented everything respectable Confucian women weren't. Promiscuous instead of chaste. Expressive instead of silent. Mobile instead of confined. The Yangban men who enforced widow suicide standards had relationships with giseng, used their services, fathered their children. The double standard was built into law and culture. Huang Jini, a giseng poet who died in 1567, left acclaimed poems and riddles. These women navigated the system by existing outside it. They had no husband to be loyal to. They had no chastity requirement. They were explicitly excluded from virtuous woman standards. That exclusion gave them mobility and voice that Yangban women didn't have, but it also made them property of the state, registered like slaves, subject to sale, vulnerable to violence without recourse. The choice wasn't between freedom and oppression, it was between different types of oppression. Yangban women had status but no autonomy. Giseng had some autonomy but no status. Commoner women had neither. The colonial period from 1910 to 1945 imposed different oppressions. Japan tried to erase Korean identity, forced Koreans to take Japanese names, suppressed the Korean language, extracted resources, conscripted labor, enslaved women in comfort stations. The Yolnyo system, already weakening as Korea began modernizing in the late 19th century, became irrelevant. The institutions that had enforced it no longer existed. The civil service exams were gone. The memorial gate rewards were gone. The legal prohibitions ended. But the ideology persisted as private family expectations. Women were still expected to prioritize family honor. Remarriage became legal, but socially complicated. The shame didn't disappear overnight. Liberation. In 1945 and the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 created further upheaval. The division into North and South Korea established different governments with different ideologies. Both rejected Joseon-era Confucianism officially. North Korea adopted socialist principles with nominal gender equality. South Korea adopted democratic principles with gradual women's rights expansion, but both societies retained conservative attitudes about women's sexuality and family roles. It took decades for widow remarriage to become fully normalized. Even now, some older generations in Korea carry the idea that a woman should be devoted to one husband. The language hasn't completely changed, but the legal and social pressure is gone. Women can remarry freely. The memorial gates stand as historical relics, not active threats. The royal tombs follow different conventions than Yeolnyemun, but share the principle of honoring the dead with physical monuments. The listing documents note that Joseon's ancestral worship practices continued through centuries despite political upheaval. Annual rituals at the tombs are still performed by royal family descendants and historical societies. The continuity shows how deeply Confucian values embedded in Korean culture. But the modern ceremonies focus on heritage preservation, not enforcing behavior. The tombs are tourist sites. The Yeolnyemun gates are photo opportunities. The silver daggers are museum artifacts. The system that killed thousands of women is safely historical. Scholars study it. Films dramatize it. The actual threat is gone. Korea has high education rates for women, but significant workplace discrimination. The corporate and political sectors remain male-dominated. The expectation that women will leave careers after marriage or childbirth persists despite legal equality. Some observers trace this to Joseon-era attitudes about women's proper place. The idea that women exist to serve families, that their individual desires matter less than family honor, that visible success by women threatens social order. These aren't explicitly Confucian arguments anymore. They're framed as practical concerns about work-life balance or natural gender differences. But the structure underneath, the assumption that women's choices should be constrained by family and social expectations, echoes the old system. The research into Yeolnyo has expanded since the 1990s as Korean scholars, particularly women historians, have access to archives and can publish without censorship. The trial documents preserved at the National Museum of Korea include petitions from widows fighting for adoption rights, complaints from widows accusing in-laws of abuse, records of widows who fled, and the lawsuits that followed. These documents complicate the traditional narrative of voluntary martyrdom. They show resistance, they show negotiation. They show that some widows found ways to survive despite the pressure. Not all followed the script, not all died willingly. The suicides that did happen were often products of extreme coercion, economic desperation, or psychological breakdown under impossible circumstances. Calling it virtuous obscures the violence. Systems that kill women for refusing arranged marriages or for perceived sexual impropriety. Systems that treat female autonomy as family shame. Joseon's Yeolnyo system is historical, but the pattern is ongoing globally. The specific mechanisms differ. The underlying logic is the same. Women's bodies are family property. Women's choices reflect on family status. Women who violate community standards deserve punishment, including death. Men who enforce these standards are protecting honor. The Korean case is well documented. 500 years of legal codes and memorial structures created an extensive archive. Other cultures with similar practices often lack that documentation, but the practice itself is widespread across history and geography. The Korean government's publication of Hangul instructional texts for women during the Joseon dynasty created an unintended consequence. Women learned to read, women learned to write. By the late Joseon period, women were producing literature, not in large numbers, not with freedom to publish openly, but the writing exists. Personal letters between women, poems expressing grief and restriction, narratives describing daily life in the inner quarters. Lady Haegyeong's memoirs written in the 18th century describe palace intrigue and family tragedy. Her son became King Jongjo. Her husband, Crown Prince Sado, was executed by being locked in a rice chest by his father, King Yeongjo. Lady Haegyeong lived through that trauma and wrote about it decades later. Her memoirs provide rare first-person documentation of women's experiences in Joseon's highest social circles. She had education and resources most women didn't have, but even she was trapped in the palace. Even she had no escape from royal politics. The most recent scholarship on Joseon women, published in journals like the International Journal of Korean History and in books from academic presses, emphasizes that women were not passive victims. They found spaces for agency within constraints. They manipulated rules when possible. They built support networks with other women. They taught daughters survival strategies. The agency was limited. The constraints were severe. But treating Joseon women only as victims raises their intelligence and resistance. They knew the system was unjust. They couldn't change it. They adapted. Some adaptations meant dying. Some meant surviving. Both were choices made under coercion. Both deserve recognition as responses to impossible situations. Restoration projects preserve them as part of Korean heritage. The preservation is controversial. Some argue that gates memorialize suffering and shouldn't be celebrated. Others argue they're historical evidence and need protection. The debate mirrors larger questions about how to remember painful history. Do you preserve the monuments to atrocities or destroy them? Does preservation honor victims or honor perpetrators? For Yeolnyo Moon, the answer isn't clear. The gate honors the widow. But it also honors the system that killed her. It stands as evidence of what happened. But it also stands as what the perpetrators wanted. A permanent advertisement that this family valued honor over life. A 1998 excavation near one of the memorial gates found a mass grave. 17 female skeletons. Carbon dating puts them in the 17th century, right after the Qing invasion. The bones show signs of malnutrition consistent with prolonged starvation. None show violent trauma. They starved themselves, or they were starved by families who kept them isolated. The grave is unmarked. The memorial gate, 200 meters away, lists one name, one virtuous woman. The other 16 aren't mentioned. No one knows who they are. The gate celebrates the one who followed the script perfectly. The other 16 get a pit and silence. That's the system's arithmetic. One name in stone. 16 ghosts. The gate stands. The bones are reburied at a different site after documentation. No monument marks where they went. Just a report in a regional archaeological journal. Page count doesn't lie.